News of the Times, The Wicked World of Rogues, a History, Crime, Compilation. Welcome to our News of the Times End of Month Crime Compilation. In today's compilation, we look at the world of rogues from our extensive database. So, what definition did we use? The dictionary defines a rogue as a dishonest or undisciplined person. For this episode, we are looking at cases where the person in question behaved in a manner or committed their crime outside of the usual norms of society. Case 1. From Pulpit to Gallows, Rogue Reverends. We launch this episode with two cases where the Reverends in question used their position to take advantage of those who were unfortunate enough to find themselves in their relative spheres. Case 2. Employers who torture. Cases where the employers who were given parish unfortunates to apprentice in a trade used their position to inflict unbelievable horrors. Case 3. The Resurrectionists. Not to be confused with burkers who killed to sell bodies to the dissectors. Resurrectionists actually dug up the graves and harvested the bodies to sell on. Case 4. England incest cases. A highly taboo subject that was often overlooked and very rarely reported. We look at the famous Braid case. Case 5. The highly disturbing case of the Reverend Wetherell. This incredible case of the Reverend Wetherell not only involves a reverend in Oxford, but also touches upon the subjects of grooming, incest, and thefts of fortunes. Case 6. The case of Agnes Norman. Agnes, a 15-year-old nanny, instead of caring for the children in her care, she seems to go on a killing spree of anyone who ends up in her path, be they infants, children, or animals. Case 7. The Clitheroe case. A husband who marries a rather wealthy woman with the new bride experiencing buyer's regret and continues to live in her original home. His reply is to abduct and imprison her until she concedes her money and his conjugal rights. 7 cases of rogue criminals from Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian times. If all of this sounds like you have found your own personal nirvana, may we ask you to tap the like button down below and subscribe if you haven't already. Your likes and subscriptions help to keep us relevant in the giant world of thousands of channels in YouTube land. Many thanks. And now, on with this month's crime compilation. Case 1. Rogue Reverends, 1700 to 1812. We start this episode looking at 3 reverends from history whose lapse in their spiritual leanings lead them to swing on the gallows. The Reverend Thomas Hunter, the discovery of his illicit affair had dire consequences to the children under his care. The reference of William Dodd, noted clergyman of his time, whose expensive lifestyle required additional funding, and lay minister Michael Whiting, whose desire for additional property and prosperity led him to attempt to kill family in order to inherit. The Reverend Thomas Hunter, 1700. We start our look at rogue reverends with the Reverend Thomas Hunter, who had illicit relations with a young girl, then murdered 2 children who had told on him. the Reverend Thomas Hunter, executed on the 22nd of August, 1700, near Edinburgh. This story comes from the Newgate Calendar. With profound sorrow, we find ourselves compelled to present to the reader a heinous murder, a character that should have been regarded as the epitome of sanctity. Never before has history been stained by a crime so calculated and cruel. Throughout time, ambition has driven tyrants to spill innocent blood. Revenge has spurred men to kill their fellow men. Jealousy, with its distorted vision, has destroyed the objects of its affection. But may the heavens forbid that we should ever again bear witness to a tutor, a minister of the gospel, deliberately taking the lives of his own pupils, the sons of his benefactor. To compound the horror, this wretched sinner expounded his offence by openly proclaiming himself an atheist, thus plumbing the depths of human depravity. This loathsome culprit was born in the county of Fife in Scotland and hailed from a prosperous farming family. His father, recognizing his potential, sent him to the venerable University of St. Andrews for his education. There, he honed his mastery of the classics and eventually earned the coveted title of Master of Arts, embarking upon the study of divinity with considerable success. In the ranks of the clergy, it is not uncommon for young ministers to assume the role of tutors in affluent and esteemed households until the opportune moment arrives for them to take holy orders, an event that typically coincides with the acquisition of a benefice. During this phase, they are commonly referred to as chaplains. Such was the case for a certain individual named Hunter, who, for approximately 2 years, served as a chaplain in the household of Mr. Gordon, a renowned merchant and esteemed baillie of Edinburgh, a position akin to that of an alderman in London. The household of Mr. Gordon was composed of various members, including the distinguished gentleman himself, his lady, their 2 sons, a daughter, and a young woman attending to Mrs. Gordon and her daughter, the aforementioned culprit, as well as several clerks and domestic servants. Hunter's primary responsibility was the education of Mr. Gordon's 2 sons, a duty he discharged to the utmost satisfaction of the parents, who regarded him as a youth of exceptional intellect and admirable character. Alas, a connection developed between Hunter and the young woman, which swiftly escalated to a morally reprehensible degree, persisting for a substantial period unbeknownst to the household. One fateful day, while Mr. and Mrs. Gordon were away on a visit, Hunter and his paramour rendezvoused in their private chamber, as was their custom. Regrettably, their lack of caution in securing the door proved to be their downfall. As the children inadvertently entered the room, bearing witness to a scene that left no room for doubt regarding the nature of their illicit liaison. Unbeknownst to anyone, the children harbored no intention of divulging the events they had witnessed to their unsuspecting parents. The eldest boy, not yet 10 years of age, joined his siblings for supper that evening, and in their innocent candor they revealed all that had transpired, leaving no room for doubt regarding the gravity of the situation. Consequently, it was decided that the female servant involved would be dismissed from the household the following day. Hunter, however, managed to retain his position within the family's employ. In order to seek redemption for his transgressions, he humbly apologized, attributing his crime to the recklessness of youth and pledging never to offend in a similar manner again. From that moment onward, a profound and lasting hatred festered within Hunter's heart towards the innocent children. He resolved in his diabolical mind to exact the most sinister vengeance upon them, sparing no thought for anything else than their murder. Yet considerable time would pass before he could seize the opportune moment to carry out this abominable plan. On pleasant days it was customary for Hunter to lead his young charges on an hour-long walk through the fields before the midday meal, often accompanied by the young lady. These excursions provided the ideal setting for his sinister designs to take shape. The events leading up to the commission of the heinous act unfolded when Mr. Gordon and his family sought respite at their country retreat, located in close proximity to Edinburgh. The family received an invitation to dine in the city, prompting Mr. and Mrs. Gordon to make plans to leave around the same time that Hunter typically embarked on his midday walk with the children. Mrs. Gordon, eager for all the children to accompany him on the visit, ardently advocated for their presence. However, her husband vehemently opposed the idea, relenting only to allow the little girl to accompany them on their excursion. Due to this unforeseen circumstance, Hunter's plan to murder all three children was foiled. Nevertheless, he remained steadfast in his resolve to extinguish the lives of the boys while they remained within his grasp. To carry out his sinister intentions, Hunter led the children to a serene spot in the fields, where he seemingly intended to rest upon the grass. This event unfolded in the latter half of August in the year 1700. Unbeknownst to the unsuspecting children, Hunter secretly readied his knife, poised to terminate their lives while they innocently engaged in the pursuit of catching butterflies and gathering wild flowers. Having sharpened his blade, Hunter called the boys to his side, reproaching them for disclosing the disturbing scene they had witnessed to their parents. He then coldly declared his intent to execute them without delay. Overwhelmed with terror, the children fled from him, desperately attempting to escape his clutches. However, Hunter pursued and recaptured them, mercilessly subjecting them to his vile intentions. Pinning down one child, he proceeded to slit the throat of the other with his penknife, repeating the same inhuman act upon the second boy. These horrifying murders were committed within a half-a-mile radius of the renowned Edinburgh Castle, giving the brazen nature of the crime perpetrated in broad daylight amidst the open fields. It was scarcely conceivable that the murderer would evade immediate apprehension. At that precise moment, a gentleman strolling upon the Castle Hill of Edinburgh caught sight of the gruesome scene. Alarmed by the unfolding tragedy, he swiftly summoned others to join him, hastening towards the lifeless bodies of the children. Meanwhile, Hunter headed towards a nearby river, contemplating his own demise through drowning. However, those in pursuit closed in just as he neared the river's edge. Recognizing his identity, they hastily dispatched a messenger to Mr. and Mrs. Gordon, who were on the verge of attending a dinner engagement with a friend, to apprise them of the unspeakable murder of their beloved sons. Words fall short in capturing the profound impact wrought by the transmission of this ghastly news. The afflicted father's sense of bewilderment and the frenzied anguish of the bereaved mother may be grasped to some extent, even if their depths defy adequate portrayal. According to an ancient Scottish law, it was decreed that if a murderer should be apprehended with the victim's blood upon their garments, they shall be prosecuted in the sheriff's court and executed within 3 days of the commission of the crime. Whilst it was not customary to enforce this sentence with absolute severity, the heinous nature of this offender's deeds left no room for clemency. The utmost rigour of the law was deemed necessary in this case. Consequently, the prisoner was confined to jail, securely chained to the floor throughout the night. The following day, the sheriff issued his order for the convening of the jury. As a result of their verdict, Hunter stood before the court for his trial, wherein he pled guilty. Shockingly, he compounded his heinous offence by proclaiming his regret for not having murdered Mr. Gordon's daughter alongside his sons, further staining his already blackened soul. In light of this damning confession, the sheriff proceeded to pass sentence upon the convict. The judgment pronounced that the ensuing day would witness his execution upon a gibbet erected at the very site where the murders were committed. But prior to this ultimate fate, his right hand would be severed with a hatchet just above the wrist. Then, by means of a rope, he would be hoisted up onto the gibbet, where, upon his death, his lifeless form would be left hanging in chains between Edinburgh and Leith. The knife, the instrument of his wicked deeds, would be impaled through his hand, which would be extended above his head, fixed to the apex of the gibbet. Accordingly, on the 22nd of August, in the year 1700, Mr. Hunter met his fate in strict accordance with the aforementioned sentence. Soon thereafter, however, Mr. Gordon approached the sheriff with a petition requesting the relocation of the body to a more secluded site. The sight of the lifeless form hanging along the highway, a route frequently traversed by Mr. Gordon, served as a painful reminder of the tragedy that had befallen him. The sheriff promptly acceded to this plea, and within a few days the body was removed to the outskirts of a small village near Edinburgh named Broughton. It is both dreadful and undeniable that, in the moments preceding his execution, Hunter uttered a profoundly shocking declaration. With his life drawing to a close, he defiantly proclaimed, "There is no God. I do not believe there is any, or if there is, I hold him in defiance." To think that this ungodly individual had the audacity to claim himself a minister of the gospel is a truth as disturbing as it is abhorrent. The Reverend William Dodd. From the unrepentant illicit relations and multiple child murdering Reverend, we now jump to something slightly tamer. The peacock, money spending, attempted swindler, and forger Reverend of the mid-18th century, who was a chaplain to King George III. Forgery at this time was considered a capital offence, on a par with murder. The famous and much respected Reverend Dodd must indeed have been under considerable financial pressure to commit the acts which ultimately led to his execution. From the Newgate Calendar, William Dodd, 1729 to 1777, hung at Tyburn. Born into a religious and respectable family, Dodd was an academic with a talent with words and a reputation for charm and persuasiveness. He also habitually was known as a man who liked the finer things in life. Dodd's insistence of living the good life whenever he could afford to or not meant that he struggled continuously to live within his means. In 1751, he married a servant girl, Mary Perkins, who certainly would have impaired his rise in status, at least initially, and would have dramatically impaired his finances. He was mingling with the lower classes by marrying her. The marriage was whispered about for years to come. His father, in trying to redirect Dodd, urged him to follow the religious path, advice with some strong arming that Dodd followed. Dodd was ordained as a priest in 1753 and became a curate in West Ham. Energetic and charming, Dodd steadily moved up the ecclesiastical ranks until in 1763 he was appointed as the chaplain ordinary King George III. In this elevated position, he was able to take on a number of higher social class students who had the money to pay exorbitant fees. His fortunes continued to rise as he became chaplain to the king himself and received his Doctor of Laws from Cambridge University. Throughout this time, Dodd continued to spend well above his means. The appellation of the Macaroni Parson followed him, as he was renowned for his extravagant and expensive clothing. His free spending and ornate dress aside, Dodd was a well-respected and also known for his charitable work. Some of the charitable work that William Dodd established: the Magdalen Home for Unmarried Mothers. Its ethos was to reclaim women who had swerved from the path of virtue. The Society for the Relief of Poor Debtors and the Humane Society to help in the recovery of those who had apparently drowned. Scandal number 1, the bribe. Always in need of additional funds and looking to improve his social and economic position, he attempted to bribe Lady Apsley, the wife of the Lord Chancellor, to help him gain the more lucrative post of rector of St. George's in prestigious Hanover Square. The bribe amount was £3,000, the equivalent to almost £500,000 in today's money. The bribe attempt was uncovered from Lady Apsley herself, with the letters from Dodd revealing all. The scandal rocked society, and Dodd was the subject of gossip in society and the butt of many a joke. Dodd was dismissed from his post. Making a hasty retreat, Dodd quickly left England for the less scandalous pastures of France and Geneva, where he stayed for 2 years before finally returning to England in 1776. Scandal 2, the forgery. Still weighted down by heavy debts from his continued luxurious lifestyle, Dodd forged a bond in the name of his old student, the Earl of Chesterfield, for £4,200, worth approximately £900,000 in 2023. The banks initially accepted the bond and lent Dodd money on the basis of it. Dodd's forgery was discovered by the Earl of Chesterfield and then relayed to the bank. The Earl of Chesterfield disowned the bond, leaving Dodd now culpable for forgery, a crime that was treated as a capital offence in Regency days. Dodd begged for time to repay the full amount back, but this was rejected. Dodd was arrested, tried, and found guilty with an overwhelming evidence against him. Dodd was popular both with the common folk and many of his peers. He had been a prolific writer, voicing a compassionate approach to justice and law. However, attempts by the public and friends to have his sentence overturned were unsuccessful. Dodd was to hang on the 27th of June, 1777. Resurrection. It had been known for people to survive hanging if they could be treated early enough, as the hanging during this time involved slow strangulation rather than the broken neck of later executions. Money was duly paid to the executioner, requesting that he stop the body from swaying and cut his body down relatively quickly. Friends were at the ready to work on resuscitating Dodd once they recovered his body. However, similar to Jack Sheppard's plan to cheat the executioner that we covered in our episode on escaped prisoners, Dodd's fans did not know the plan. Dodd's death coach was mobbed by thousands of fans once he had been cut down, thereby delaying any kind of medical treatment for over 2 hours. Survival? The news report stated that Dodd had been buried at Cowley in Middlesex, yet there is no recording of his burial having taken place there. For years to come, friends who had known him claimed to have seen him in France and Scotland. Did he manage to escape an executioner's death? It remains a mystery. We end this episode of Rogue Reverends with the story of Michael Whiting, a lay preacher who also worked as a flower supplier. Living next door to his 2 brothers-in-law, Whiting comes up with a plan to take over their property. From the Newgate calendar, Michael Whiting executed on the 19th of March, 1812. Michael Whiting, Methodist preacher, sentenced to death for poisoning his 2 brothers-in-law with an intent to possess himself of their property in 1811. On the fateful morning of Tuesday the 12th of March, 1811, an ominous sequence of events unfolded, forever altering the lives of those involved. The Langman siblings dispatched their sister to the dwelling of the accused in order to borrow a loaf of bread. Unbeknownst to them, this seemingly mundane errand would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to tragedy. The prisoner, accompanied by their sister, returned to the Langmans' residence, bearing not only the requested loaf, but also a promise to provide flour and pork for a delectable pudding to grace their dinner table. With these provisions in hand, the accused departed, only to reappear shortly thereafter with the basin brimming with flour and pork. Directing his words to the housekeeper, the prisoner remarked, "Catherine, be sure you make the boys a pudding before you go." Following this peculiar instruction, he whisked away the youngest child, bringing him to his own abode for their shared midday repast. Meanwhile, the housekeeper diligently set to work preparing 2 puddings. However, she noted with perplexity that the flour failed to bind as expected, leaving the puddings in a kneading trough. she proceeded to boil one of them for the anticipated meal. The ill-fated diners had scarcely consumed a few mouthfuls before an overpowering sickness gripped them, inducing violent vomiting. A grave suspicion arose that the pudding had been poisoned. In an attempt to confirm their suspicions, one of the Langmans offered a small piece to a sow in their yard, which swiftly devoured it, only to succumb to illness and, after a lingering struggle, to meet its demise. While the elder brother managed to recover from the ordeal, the younger sibling languished in a precarious state for several agonizing days. Subsequent analysis by Mr. Wollaston, a distinguished professor of chemistry at the University of Cambridge, revealed that the remnants of the pudding contained a significant quantity of a corrosive subliminate of mercury, a deadly poison. The accused, who, it transpired, dealt in flour, made a feeble attempt to explain the poisoning by claiming that he had recently employed nux vomica to eradicate vermin, suggesting that traces of it might have inadvertently found their way into his flour bin. However, Mr. Wollaston vehemently asserted that the pudding contained no other poisonous substance except corrosive sublimate. Furthermore, evidence surfaced indicating that the prisoner, who traded in drugs, had acquired a substantial quantity of that very poison from his predecessor in the business. It also came to light that upon learning of the Langman's poisoning, the accused hastily emptied and washed out his flour bins. Representing the prisoner's defence, Mr. Alley, hailing from London, made his case before the court. The trial, an arduous affair, endured until 6 o'clock in the evening. Following a mere 10 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Without delay, the judge pronounced the sentence of death, leaving the prisoner to face the gallows as the final chapter in this tragic tale. Case 2. Employers who torture, 1767 to 1829. Our regular listeners will be familiar with the fate of unfortunates such as widows and orphans in Georgian and Victorian times, who would fall under the protection of the parish. The parish in turn would send out children to a farm or tradespersons in order for them to learn a trade and skills from which they would eventually be able to sustain themselves. However, it was rare that any checks would be made upon those sent out to be apprenticed. Employers, taking advantage of the situation, would often use this free help as slave labour. And then there was the worst cases, where a child or a teenager ended up in the hands of a sadist. Elizabeth Brownrigg, 4th of September 1767. We start our review of employers who torture with the infamous case of Mrs. Brownrigg. This case from 1767 was still referred to 100 years later. It was that infamous. In short, Mrs. Brownrigg had a number of apprentices with their particulars raised in the trial. They were Mary Mitchell, Mary Jones, and Mary Clifford. The girls were originally orphaned and were apprenticed to the Brownriggs as an alternative to the expense of their paying for domestic help. The cruelty inflicted on the girls is extreme and include whippings on bare backs to the point where the whippings had to be taken over by another due to weariness, lack of food and water, lack of clothing, regular beatings.
were only a few of the tortures inflicted on the girls as recounted in the press of the day. From the Newgate Calendar, the long and excruciating torture in which this inhuman woman kept the innocent object of her remorseless cruelty before she finished the long premeditated murder more engaged the attention and roused the indignation of all ranks than any criminal in the whole course of our melancholy narratives. Elizabeth Brownrigg was married to James Brownrigg, a plumber, who, after being 7 years in Greenwich, came to London and took a house in Flower de Luce Court, Fleet Street, where he carried on a considerable share of business and had a little house at Islington for an occasional retreat. She had been the mother of 16 children, and having practised midwifery, was appointed by the overseers of the poors of St. Dunstan's parish to take care of the poor women in the workhouse, which duty she performed to the entire satisfaction of her employers. Mary Jones. Mary Mitchell, a poor girl of the precinct of Whitefriars, was put apprentice to Mrs. Brownrigg in the year 1765, and at about the same time Mary Jones, one of the children of the Foundling Hospital, was likewise placed with her in the same capacity, and she had other apprentices. As Mrs. Brownrigg received women to lie in privately, these girls were taken with a view of saving the expense of women servants. At first, the poor orphans were treated with some degree of civility, but this was soon changed for the most savage barbarity. Having laid Mary Jones across 2 chairs in the kitchen, she whipped her with such wanton cruelty that she was occasionally obliged to desist through mere weariness. This treatment was frequently repeated, and Mrs. Brownrigg used to throw water on her when she had done whipping her, and sometimes she would dip her head into a pail of water. The room appointed for the girl to sleep in adjoined the passage leading to the street door, and as she had received many wounds on her head, shoulders, and various parts of her body, she determined not to bear such treatment any longer if she could effect her escape. Mary Jones' escape. Observing that the key was left in the street door when the family went to bed, she opened the door cautiously one morning and escaped into the street. Thus freed from her horrid confinement, she repeatedly inquired her way to the Foundling Hospital till she found it, and was admitted, after describing in what manner she had been treated and showing the bruises that she had received. The child having been examined by a surgeon, who found her wounds to be of a most alarming nature, the governors of the hospital ordered Mr. Plumtree, their solicitor, to write to James Brownrigg, threatening a prosecution if he did not give a proper reason for the severities exercised upon the child. No notice of this having been taken, and the governors of the hospital thinking it imprudent to indict at common law, the girl was discharged in consequence of an application to the Chamberlain of London. So it would seem that although Mary Jones's statements could be backed up by the scars and bruises on her body, the authorities decided to take no action against the Brownriggs. Instead, the authorities bound another orphan to the Brownriggs, Mary Clifford. The Newgate Calendar continues. Mary Clifford. The other girl, Mary Mitchell, continued with her mistress for the space of a year, during which she was treated with equal cruelty, and she had also resolved to quit her service. Having escaped out of the house, she was met in the street by the younger son of Brownrigg, who forced her to return home, where her sufferings were greatly aggravated on account of her escape. Mary Clifford torture. In the interim, the overseers of the precinct of Whitefriars bound Mary Clifford to Brownrigg. It was not long before she experienced similar cruelties to those inflicted on the other poor girls, and possibly still more severe. She was frequently tied up, naked, and beaten with a hearth broom, a horsewhip, or a cane, till she was absolutely speechless. This poor girl having a natural infirmity, the mistress could not permit her to lie in a bed, but placed her on a mat in a coal hole that was remarkably cold. However, after some time, a sack and a quantity of straw formed her bed instead of the mat. During her confinement in this wretched situation, she had nothing to subsist on but bread and water, and her covering during the night consisted only of her own clothes, so that she sometimes lay almost perished with the cold. On a particular occasion, when she was almost starving with hunger, she broke open a cupboard in search of food, but found it empty, and on another occasion she broke down some boards in order to procure a draught of water. Though she was thus pressed for the humblest necessities of life, Mrs. Brownrigg determined to punish her with rigour for the means that she had taken to supply herself with them. On this, she caused the girl to strip to the skin, and during the course of a whole day, while she remained naked, she repeatedly beat her with the butt end of a whip. In the course of this most inhuman treatment, a jack chain was fixed around her neck, the end of which was fastened to the yard door, and then it was pulled as tight as possible, without strangling her. A day being passed in the practice of these savage barbarities, the girl was remanded to the coal hole at night, her hands being tied together and the chain still remaining about her neck. The husband being obliged to find his wife's apprentices in wearing apparel, they were repeatedly stripped naked and kept so for whole days if their garments happened to be torn. Sometimes Mrs. Brownrigg then resolved on uncommon severity, used to tie their hands with a cord and draw them up to a water pipe which ran across the ceiling in the kitchen, but that giving way, she desired her husband to fix a hook in the beam, through which a cord was drawn, and their arms being extended, she used to horsewhip them till she was weary, and till the blood flowed at every stroke. The eldest son one day directed Mary Clifford to put up a half-tester bedstead, but the poor girl was unable to do it, on which he beat her till she could no longer support his severity, and at another time, when the mother had been whipping her in the kitchen till she was absolutely tired, the son renewed the savage treatment. Mrs. Brownrigg would sometimes seize the poor girl by the cheeks, and forcing the skin down violently with her fingers, caused the blood to gush from her eyes. Mary Clifford asks for help. Mary Clifford, unable to bear these repeated severities, complained of her hard treatment to a French lady who lodged in the house, and she, having represented the impropriety of such behaviour to Mrs. Brownrigg, the inhuman monster flew at the girl and cut her tongue in 2 places with a pair of scissors. On the morning of the 13th of July, this barbarous woman went into the kitchen and, after obliging Mary Clifford to strip to the skin, drew her up to the staple, and through her body was an entire sore from former bruises. Yet this wretch renewed her cruelties with her accustomed severity. After whipping her till the blood streamed down her body, she let her down and made her wash herself in a tub of cold water. Mary Mitchell, the other poor girl, being present during this transaction. While Clifford was washing herself, Mrs. Brownrigg struck her on the shoulders, already sore with former bruises, with the butt end of a whip, and she treated the child in this manner 5 times in the same day. Mrs. Brownrigg's deeds become known. The poor girl's wounds now began to show evident signs of mortification, and it is probable that she might have been privately buried, and the murderess escaped detection but for the following circumstances. Mary Clifford's mother-in-law, who had resided some time in the county, came to town and inquired after the child, and being informed that she was placed at Brownrigg's, she went thither, but was refused admittance by Mrs. Brownrigg, who even threatened to carry her before the Lord Mayor if she came there to make further disturbances. Information to Mary Clifford's mother-in-law. Hereupon the mother-in-law was going away when Mrs. Deacon, the wife of Mr. Deacon, baker at the adjoining house, called her in, and informed her that she and her family had often heard moaning and groaning issuing from the Brownriggs' house, and that she suspected the apprentices were treated with unwarrantable severity. Mrs. Deacon likewise promised to exert herself to come at the truth of the affair. At this juncture, Mr. Brownrigg, going to Hampstead on business, bought a hog which he sent home. This hog was put into a covered yard to which there was a skylight, which it was thought necessary to remove in order to give air to the animal. Neighbour servants watching the Brownrigg house. As soon as it was known that the skylight was removed, Mr. Deacon ordered his servant to watch, in order, if possible, to discover the girls. Deacon's servant maid, looking from a window, saw one of the girls stooping down, on which she called her mistress, and she desired the attendance of some of the neighbours, who, having been witnesses of the shocking scene, some men got upon their leads and dropped bits of dirt to induce the girl to speak to them, but she seemed wholly incapable. Demanding to see Mary Clifford. Hereupon Mrs. Deacon sent to the girl's mother-in-law, who, going to the overseers who had placed out the child, they called on Mr. Grundy, one of the overseers of St. Dunstan's, and all of them going together, they demanded a sight of Mary Clifford, but Brownrigg told them that he knew no such person, but if they wanted to see Mary, meaning Mary Mitchell, they might, and accordingly produced her. Mary Mitchell instead of Mary Clifford. Mr. Deacon's servant now declared that Mary Mitchell was not the girl who had been seen in the shocking situation above mentioned, on which Mr. Grundy sent for a constable to search the house, which was done, but no discovery was then made. Mr. Brownrigg threatened highly, but Mr. Grundy, with the spirit that became the officer of a parish, took Mary Mitchell with him to the workhouse, where, on the taking off her leathern bodice, it stuck so fast to her wounds that she shrieked with the pain. But on being treated with great humanity and told that she would not be sent back to Brownrigg, she gave an account of the horrid treatment that she and Mary Clifford had sustained, and confessed that she had met the latter on the stairs just before they came to the house. Finding Mary Clifford. On this, Mr. Grundy and some others returned to the house to make a stricter search, on which Brownrigg sent for a lawyer in order to intimidate them, and even threatened a prosecution unless they immediately quitted the house. And terrified by these threats, Mr. Grundy sent for a coach to carry Brownrigg to the Compter, on which the latter promised to produce the girl in half an hour if the coach was discharged. This being consented to, the girl then produced from a cupboard under a bosset in the dining room. It is not in language to describe the miserable appearance of this poor girl maid. Almost her whole body was ulcerated. Being taken to the workhouse, an apothecary was sent for, who pronounced her to be in danger. Mrs. Brownrigg and son escaped. Brownrigg was conveyed to Wood Street, Compter, but his wife and son made their escape, taking them a gold watch and some money. Mr. Brownrigg was carried before Alderman Crosby, who committed him and ordered the girls to be taken to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where Mary Clifford died within a few days. The coroner's inquest was summoned and found a verdict of wilful murder against James and Elizabeth Brownrigg and John, their son. In the meantime, Mrs. Brownrigg and her son shifted from place to place in London, bought clothes in Rag Fair to disguise themselves, and then went to Wandsworth, where they took lodgings in the house of Mr. Dunbar, who kept a chandler's shop. Mrs. Brownrigg and son discovered and caught. This chandler, happening to read a newspaper on the 15th of August, saw an advertisement which so clearly described his lodgers that he had no doubt that they were the murderers. A constable went to the house, and the mother and son were conveyed to London. The trial. At the ensuing sessions at the Old Bailey, the father, the mother, and son were indicted, when Elizabeth Brownrigg, after a trial of 11 hours, was found guilty of murder and ordered for execution, but the man and his son, being acquitted of the higher charge, were detained to take their trials for a misdemeanour of which they were convicted and imprisoned for the space of 6 months. After a sentence of death was passed on Mrs. Brownrigg, she was attended by a clergyman, to whom she confessed the enormity of her crime, and acknowledged the justice of the sentence by which she had been condemned. The parting between her and her husband and her son on the morning of her execution was affecting beyond description. The son falling on his knees, she bent herself to him and embraced him. The husband was kneeling on the other side. She also kneeled down, and having besought the Almighty to have mercy on her soul, said, "Dear James, I beg that God, for Christ's sake, will be reconciled, and that he will not leave me, forsake me, in the hour of death and in the day of judgment." On her way to the place of execution, the people expressed their abhorrence of her crime in terms which, though not proper for the occasion, testified their astonishment that such a wretch could have existed. They even prayed for her damnation instead of her salvation. They doubted not but that the devil would fetch her, and hoped that she would go to hell. Such were the sentiments of the mob. At the place of execution, this miserable woman joined in prayers with the ordinary of Newgate, whom she desired to declare to the multitude that she confessed her guilt and acknowledged the justice of her sentence. After execution, her body was put into a hackney coach, conveyed to Surgeons' Hall, dissected and anatomized, and her skeleton was hung up in Surgeons' Hall. From the extreme torture inflicted by Mrs. Brownrigg in 1767, we jump to 1829 and the Hibners, mother and daughter. Again, this case involves apprentices. The children are impoverished and orphaned, and at the mercy of those who are paid to teach them a trade. From the Broadsides, April 1829. Particulars of the trial and execution of Esther Hibner the elder, for the wilful murder of Francis Pulpit, a parish apprentice, who was executed this morning at the Old Bailey on the 4th of April, 1829. Esther Hibner the elder was indicted with her daughter and Anne Robinson, their forewoman, for the wilful murder of Francis Pulpit, a child only 10 years of age. Mr. Boland stated the case to the jury. The deceased, who was only 10 years old, was a pauper and was apprenticed to the prisoner Esther Hibner the elder, who resided at Platt Terrace, Pancras Road, by the overseers of St. Martin's Parish, to learn the business of fabricating tambour work. For our listeners, tambour work was white stitching on white gowns, a type of embroidery. Frances was apprenticed on the 7th of April, 1828, and in the month of October following her apprenticeship, a system of the most cruel and unnatural treatment was commenced by the prisoners towards the unfortunate deceased and other children who were placed under the prisoner's care by St. Martin's and other parishes. They were not allowed sufficient sustenance. They were compelled to rise to begin work at 3 or 4 in the morning. They were kept working at night until 11 o'clock, sometimes 2 in the morning, and sometimes all night. They had scarcely any bed to lie on, and frequently during the most inclement season their nesting place was the flooring, and their only covering was an old rag. The prisoners and their family had good bedding and clothes and every comfort that they desired. The children were not permitted to go out to obtain necessary air and exercise, and thus the cruel treatment they had experienced had terminated fatally with 3 of them. The child, which was subject to the present indictment, Francis Pulpit, had been reduced to such a deplorable condition that her feet mortified, and this, combined with the bursting of an abscess on the lungs brought on by the ill treatment the child had experienced, occasioned her death. The breakfast which was allowed the children was a slice of bread and a cup of milk, and if they were indulged with this luxury, they had no more food all the day. Sometimes the elder Hibner said the deceased and the other children had not earned their breakfast, and then a few potatoes were given them in the midst of the morning, and nothing more afterwards till the following morning. 9 pounds of potatoes were divided amongst the whole family, which consisted of 12 persons. They were allowed meat only once a fortnight, and on Sundays the children were locked in the kitchen, the windows of which were closed. It could be proven that the younger prisoner, Hibner, had taken the deceased Francis Pulpit from the frame and knocked her down on the floor. She had then taken Francis up and knocked her down again. When the elder prisoner was informed that Francis was lying in a room ill, instead of affording her that protection which she was bound to do, she replied, "Let her lie there." Frances, then in that state that she could scarcely crawl about the house, was told by the younger Hibner to clean the stairs. She attempted to do it, but fell exhausted and was unable to accomplish the task. The younger Hibner then took Frances up the stairs and flogged her with the cane and a rod, and afterwards sent her down to finish the stairs. When Frances came down, she was unable, from weakness, to go to the proper place to obey the calls of nature, and wetted the stairs. When Hibner the younger discovered it, she rubbed the child's nose and face in it, and afterwards plunged her head into a pail of water. The prisoner Robinson, the forewoman, who was standing by, encouraged the younger Hibner to commit this violence, and said, "Curse her, do it again, and that will finish her." The children often cried for food, and to satisfy the cravings of nature, had eaten the meat that was brought in for the day, and also some pieces of meat which they picked out of the wash that was obtained for feeding the pig. It would be proved also that all the prisoners had beaten Francis, sometimes with a cane, sometimes with a rod, and sometimes with a shoe. Evidence. 3 of the unfortunate children were called to give evidence, who fully supported the statement made by counsel. Mr. Wright, a surgeon, said that he saw the deceased Frances Pulpit. She had sores on her feet and her toes were mortifying and dropping off. After death, he examined the body and found that the lungs were nearly destroyed by abscess, and the body was otherwise deceased. There was also several bruises on the outside of the body. The real cause of death was the abscess on the lungs and the mortification of the feet. These were produced by the want of food and exercise, and the improper treatment which the child had received, and 2 other surgeons gave similar testimony. Defence. On being called upon their defence, the elder Hibner said she would leave her defence in the hands of her daughter. The daughter said that the children had sworn falsely. She stated that the children had been treated with the greatest kindness by herself and her mother, and there was not the slightest grounds for the accusation which had been referred against them. Robinson declared that what was alleged against her was false. She was only employed in the business and went home every night at 8. 2 witnesses were called who, instead of giving evidence in favour of the prisoners, spoke of their inhumanity to the children. The verdict. Mr. Baron Garrow summoned up the evidence in a feeling and impressive manner, and the jury retired for 1 hour. When they returned into the court, they found Esther Hibner the elder guilty and acquitted the other 2. The recorder then passed sentence of death upon the prisoner, during which time she stood at the bar unmoved. But when mention was made of her body being given for dissection, a slight convulsive tremor agitated her frame, but it was soon over, and she walked from the bar to the prison as firmly as the jailer who conducted her. Execution. At the usual hour this morning, the wretched woman was led to the fatal spot and was soon after launched into eternity, in the view of an immense number of spectators, chiefly females, whose groans and hisses the prisoner must have heard. Executed 13th of April, 1829. The daughter and Robinson are to be tried for assaulting the other children, and we hope they will be severely punished.
Case 3, the Resurrectionists, 1777 to 1829. Possibly no one better fits the description of a rogue than the Georgian and early Victorian phenomena of resurrectionists. Better known as grave robbers, these people would canvass cemeteries looking for freshly dug graves, which they would then rob in the dead of night. The bodies would be given to the medical hospitals, desperate for cadavers which were used to train new medical students. Resurrectionists, after robbing the body of any jewellery left with the body, would often be paid a premium for the corpse with no questions asked.
We start this episode from a chronicle from the Newgate Calendar, December 1777. John Holmes and Peter Williams, publicly whipped by the sentence of the Middlesex Court of Quarter Sessions for December 1777 for stealing dead bodies. The robbers were vulgarly called in London resurrection men, but rather should have been called sacrilegious robbers of our holy church, not even confining the unnatural crimes to men alone. The gentler sex were connected in this horrid traffic, whose business it was to strip off the shroud or whatever garments in which the body might have been wrapped, and sell them, while the men, through the darkness of a night, dragged the naked bodies to be anatomized. When Hunter, the famous anatomist, was in full practice, he had a surgical theatre being his house in Windmill Street, where he gave lectures to a very numerous class of pupils. To this place such numbers of dead bodies were brought during the winter season that the mob rose several times and were upon the point of pulling down his house. He had a well dug in the back of his premises, whereupon was thrown the putrid flesh, with it alkalines, in order to hasten the consumption thereof. Nevertheless, were the instances of dead bodies seized to be carried to the surgeons, hackney coachmen for an extra fare, and porters with hampers were often employed by the resurrection men for this purpose. A monthly publication in March 1776 says the remains of more than 20 bodies were discovered in a shed in Tottenham Court Road, supposed to have been deposited there by traders to the surgeons, of whom there is one, it is said, in the borough, who makes an open profession of dealing in dead bodies, and is well known by the name of the Resurrectionist. Still more shocking, it has been told, that the men who were paid for protecting the sacred deposits of the mortal remains of their fellow parishioners were often confederates with those carcass stealers, as the present case will demonstrate. Holmes, the principal villain in this case, was gravedigger at St. George's, Bloomsbury. Williams was his assistant, and a woman named Esther Donaldson was an accomplice. They were all indicted for stealing the dead body of Mrs. Jane Sainsbury, who departed this life on the 9th of October, then last past, and the corpse was interred into the burying ground of St. George's on the Monday following. They were detected before they could secure their booty, and the widower determined, however unpleasant, to prosecute them. In order to their conviction, he had undergone the mental pain of viewing and identifying the remains of his wife. The gravedigger and his deputy were convicted on the fullest evidence, and it was regretted that it did not reach the woman, though no doubt remained of her equal guilt. She therefore was released, but Holmes and Williams were sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment and to be whipped twice on their bare backs from the end of Kingsgate Street, Holborn, to Dyot Street, St. Giles, being half a mile, which was inflicted with the severity due to so detestable an offence through crowds of exulting spectators. From that earlier recorded case of grave robbing in 1777, we move into the Diary of a Resurrectionist, written by Joseph Naples, re-released in 1899. One of the most gruesome of books ever written was assuredly the Diary of a Resurrectionist, which contains the actual records as written out day to day by a resurrectionist named Joseph Naples, son of a bookbinder, then a sailor, next a gravedigger at the Sparfields burial ground. From here he was enticed to join an adventurous crew of resurrection men. The actual diary, which forms rather creepy reading, tells how, night after night, Naples and his companions visited the graveyards in and around London for their gruesome business, with the intervals when one of the others of the gang was too drunk to go out. One entry in the diary reads, Friday, 10th of December 1811, intoxicated all day, at night went out and got 5 bodies. Burnhill Row, Jack almost buried. Other entries read, went down to St. Thomas's, got paid £8 8 for 2 adults. Another got 7 large and 3 small bodies. Took 2 over to St. Guy's. The diary entries are short and non-emotional. Came home to St. Ben, settled £14 6 each man. Got up at 2, me and Jack and Bill went to Burnhill Row and got 3 bodies. Received £4 and 4 for adult. Went to look out, came home, went to the play, came home to the Rockingham Arms, got drunk. Besides supplying the hospitals, Naples and his crew did a good deal of exporting business by sending off bodies to Scotland, as can be seen by such entries as packed 4 and sent them to Edinburgh. Saturday 5th. Remained at Bartholomew packing up for Edinburgh. Sent 12 to the wharf for Edinburgh. As police were instructed to keep an eye out for the resurrectionists, stories such as the following mistake occurred. From the Public Ledger and Daily Advertiser, December 1814. Yesterday, a person named Price was examined on suspicion of having been at the resurrection of the dead in a neighbouring churchyard in Aldermanbury. The prisoner was stopped by a constable at a late hour on the preceding evening in company with a female who was giving him some sort of direction about the disposal of a subject which he had in his possession. The constable, who watched the movements of the prisoner and his coadjutor, was dreadfully assailed by the intolerable stench which issued from the sack. Upon opening it, he discovered, to his horror, the mortal remains of a reverend seer, who appeared from the puerility of his carcass to have departed this life many weeks hence. He accordingly took the supposed resurrectionist into custody, but the lady escaped. It was validated later that the corpse had been legally disinterred for private operations to be performed on by one of the surgeons, and the said Mr. Price was released without charge. Resurrectionists or grave robbers were regarded with horror, quite understandably, from the general populace. This story from 1818 described the upset perfectly. From the News Time, London, 1818, Resurrectionists. Between 4 and 5 on Sunday morning, a chaise cart driven by one man and followed on foot by 6 others was observed by Constable Wilkinson, the night constable of St. Saviour's. Suspecting that something was wrong, he attempted to stop the horse for the purpose of searching the cart, but the men on foot prevented any near approach to the vehicle. The party at last stopped in front of St. Thomas's Hospital, and 3 sacks containing something of a bulky appearance were conveyed from the cart into the hospital by the driver of the cart and the 5 men who had followed on foot. They then immediately drove off in a hasty manner. The night constable the following day stated what had occurred, and a report circulated through the borough. Upon more particular inquiry, it was ascertained that the body of Miss M, which had been interred some 7 days previously, had been torn from the grave. The friends and relations of the deceased, together with the friends of several other persons who had recently interred in the burial grounds in the London Road, proceeded to that place on Tuesday evening. Attended by several constables, they commenced opening the graves of those persons who had been recently interred, and in the space of a few minutes 4 coffins were found to contain nothing but stones and dirt. The horror and indignation felt by the surviving relations and friends cannot be described. The whole neighbourhood became alarmed. Husbands implored the constables to search and ascertain whether their wives had been removed, wives for their husbands, parents for their children. A cart was procured, and the empty coffins were placed upon it in such a manner as to be most conspicuous to view. Lighted torches were held by some of the party, which swelled upwards of 1,000 people. The assembly made their way to the magistrates at Union Hall. The magistrate could only join in his regret to those of the complainants, without being able to address the actual grievance. Another story in 1824 shows that even cadavers of babies were not protected from grave robbers. From the Perthshire Courier, December 1824, missing baby. A man lately died possessed of a considerable property. A woman who lived with him in character of a housekeeper has, since his decease, attempted to prove herself as his widow. For want of better evidence to establish their claim, she pleaded to having a dead-born child from the deceased 10 months ago. Doubt as to the validity of the housekeeper's plea caused the infant's grave to be opened yesterday in the presence of an eyewitness. To their astonishment, the coffin contained, instead of a human body, a quantity of dough mixed with ashes. One happy circumstances where the presence of resurrectionists actually saved a man from dying a slow death, entombed in his coffin, takes place in 1824. In this story, John McIntyre, in April 1824, was actually saved by grave robbers. McIntyre had the misfortune to be buried alive. The body snatchers were on his track, took him up and sold him to the doctors to be dissected, and a curious old broadside penny paper of the time exists telling the tale of his wonderful experience and sensations on finding himself buried alive and then taken up again in a strange way. A mysterious illness had fully paralyzed him, with an appearance of death, although he remained fully conscious. He remembers his death being confirmed and his family mourning him. He was fully awake during his burial wake, and he watched as he was sealed in his coffin and buried. He described hearing the clods of dirt falling upon his coffin tomb, and then silence in the dark, entombed in his coffin. Several hours later he heard digging, and a gang of grave robbers broke into his coffin and pulled his body out. From here they stripped him and delivered his body to a local university. John described being placed onto a dissection table with students and doctors surrounding him. He felt the knife slice his chest, and he awoke. Doctors, realizing they were not dealing with a corpse, helped to revive him, and he fully recovered. This story from 1829 is an interesting twist on grave robbing, as the body theft actually took place from a house before the body could be buried. In 1829, James Bell was transported for life for his conviction of stealing a body from a house. The body had been laid out in the house waiting for a coroner's jury to officially pronounce cause of death. From the Newgate Calendar, 1829. Bell, on the 17th of December 1829, was placed at the bar at the Maidstone Assizes before Mr. Baron Garrow, under a charge of burglariously breaking and entering the dwelling house of Daniel Reday at Deptford, and stealing therein a shirt, a worsted comforter, and the body of a man whose name was unknown. It appeared that Daniel Redday was a lodging-house keeper at Deptford. An unfortunate man had come to lodge in his house shortly before the 20th of November, and on the 19th died suddenly. His body was laid out in a back room with the shirt on and the comforter round his neck until a coroner's jury could sit on them. In the course of the night of the 20th, the prosecutor was alarmed by a noise in the room of the dead man. Not choosing to examine him in the cause from within, he went out of the house and soon perceived a ladder placed up against the window of the room in which the corpse was deposited, and 4 men, of whom the prisoner was one, on the ladder. In his hurry to apprehend them, he ran against the ladder, and the whole 4, with the corpse, the comforter, and the shirt, came to the ground. 3 of the 4 men made a successful retreat, but the prisoner was taken into custody. The jury found him guilty, and Mr. Baron Garrow, after having commented upon the heinous nature of his crime, aimed as it was at the best interests of society, sentenced him to be transported for life. We finish this review of Resurrectionists with an excerpt what can only be called The Dead Men's Petition to Parliament, publication date unknown. To the Honourable the House of Commons, the petition of all dead bodies now interred in the different churchyards of London and its environs must humbly showeth that your petitioners and your petitioners' ancestors, since the establishment of Christianity, have ever considered as a sacred deposit not to be touched by the hands of humans cutting our human carcass butchers. That many of your petitioners' brethren in death have, for no earthly crime whatsoever, been torn from their peaceful sepulchres in the dead of night by a set of robbers vulgarly called the Resurrection Men, in order to be openly exposed, cut up, and made into skeletons by the said cutting and human carcass butchers, contrary to all the fine feelings of the mind and to every principle of that respect which is due to the last retreat, if human.
Case 4. England Incest Cases, 1834 to 1836. A highly taboo subject that was most certainly rarely represented within the press and where people looked the other way. It most certainly did happen, but rarely was seen in the papers. One case that was quite famous was the Braid case from 1834. Interestingly, this case was generally not covered in the papers. Instead, the story was described in the broadsides, and that was only due to the execution.
Meaning of brother and sister German. This is an archaic term that refers to the siblings as being full brother and sister rather than half brother and sister. The siblings were born from the same mother and father. From the broadsides, 17th of February 1834, trial and sentence. A full and particular account of the trial and sentence of Thomas Braid and Mary Braid, or Morrison, brother and sister German, who were tried yesterday, Monday, before the High Court of Judiciary for incest and murder, and who are Mary Braid or Morrison to be executed on Monday the 17th of February and her body to be buried within the precincts of the jail, and Thomas Braid to be banished for life. On Monday, 27th of January, 1834, came on the trial of Thomas Braid and Mary Braid, or Morrison, brother and sister German, accused of incest and murder, both of which crimes are forbidden by the laws of God and man. In the 18th chapter of Leviticus, incest is particularly forbidden under the severest denunciations, and in an act passed in the first Parliament of James VI, it is their statute to be punishable to the death. The sixth commandment says, "Thou shalt not kill," and in another part of Holy Writ it is stated, "Whoever sheddeth a man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed." Notwithstanding which, the libel charges the said Thomas Braid and Mary Braid, or Morrison, both and each, or one of the others of them, guilty of the said crimes of incest and murder, or of one of the other of them, actor or actors, or art and part. Insofar as during the years 1832 and 1833, or part thereof, and at various places within the county of Edinburgh, you, the said Thomas Braid and Mary Braid, or Morrison, being brother and sister German, as aforesaid, did wickedly and unlawfully carry on an incestuous intercourse with each other. Charge 1. In particular, during the months of May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December of 1832, and January and February 1833, or part thereof, within the house at Stenhouse, in the parish of Liberton and county of Edinburgh, then occurred by Janet Begbie or Braid, your mother, or elsewhere to the prosecution unknown, in the said parish of Liberton or near vicinity. You, the said Thomas Braid and Mary Braid, or Morrison, being brother and sister German, as aforesaid, did wickedly and unlawfully carry on an incestuous intercourse together, and did on various occasions during the said period abuse your bodies with each other. And in consequence of the said incestuous intercourse, you, the said Mary Braid or Morrison, became pregnant, and were therefore delivered of a living female child on or about the 10th day of April, 1833, within the house in the Canongate, in or near Edinburgh, then occupied by Charity Anderson or Hardy, widow, then residing there, and now or lately residing in Hill Place, in or near Edinburgh. Charge 2. Likewise, during the months of March, April, and May 1833, or part thereof, within the house in Canongate aforesaid, then occupied as aforesaid by the said Charity Anderson or Hardy. You, the said Thomas Braid and Mary Braid, alias Morrison, being brother and sister German, as aforesaid, did wickedly and unlawfully carry on an incestuous intercourse with each other, and did cohabitate together as husband and wife, and on occasions during the said period were there in naked bed together, and did abuse your bodies with each other. Charge 3. Likewise, during the months of June, July, and August 1833, or part thereof, within the house in the Canongate aforesaid, then occupied by you, the said Thomas Braid and Mary Braid, or Morrison, or by one or other of you. You, the said Thomas Braid and Mary Braid, or Morrison, being brother and sister German, as aforesaid, did wickedly and unlawfully carry on an incestuous intercourse with each other, and on various occasions during the said period were there in naked bed together, and did abuse your bodies with each other. Charge 4. Moreover, you, the said Mary Braid or Morrison, having, on or about the 10th day of April, 1833, been delivered of a living female child, of which you had become pregnant in consequence, as aforesaid, of the incestuous intercourse above libelled, or in consequence of other carnal intercourse, to the prosecutor unknown. You, the said Thomas Braid and Mary Braid or Morrison, did both each on one or other of you upon the 16th day of August 1833, or upon one or other of the days of that month, or of July immediately preceding, or of September immediately following, at or near to a part of the Edinburgh and Glasgow Union Canal, near the first stone bridge on the said canal, as reckoned from Port Hopetown in or near Edinburgh, or at or near to some other part of the said canal, betwixt Port Hopetown aforesaid and the second stone bridge on the said canal, reckoned as aforesaid, or elsewhere, to the prosecutor unknown, in the county of Edinburgh, wickedly and feloniously put to death and murder the said child by throwing it into the said canal, having a rope fastened round its neck and a stone or some other heavy substance attached to the said rope, for the purpose of sinking its body in the water, and by leaving it there sunk accordingly, or by some other means, to the prosecutor unknown, and the dead body of the said child, which was murdered by you, the said Thomas Braid and Mary Braid or Morrison, or by one or other of you, was therefore on or about the 22nd day of August 1833, found floating in the said canal near the first stone bridge aforesaid. The witnesses. In support of these heinous charges, 36 witnesses were adducted, but the trial having proceeded with closed doors, we cannot, of course, state any particulars of the evidence at all. Some exculpatory witnesses were then examined when the jury were addressed for the prosecution by the Solicitor General, and 4th prisoners by Mr. Monteith at considerable length. The presiding judge, Lord Meadowbank, summoned up the evidence and said the jury found Mary Braid or Morrison guilty, but the libel not proven against Thomas Braid, the former. Mary Braid was then sentenced to be executed on the morning of the 17th of February next, and her body to be buried within the precincts of the jail. The latter, Thomas Braid, to be banished beyond the seas for the period of his natural life. The trial created a great deal of interest and lasted nearly 18 hours. From the Inverness Courier, 5th of February 1834. The High Court of Justiciary. The court were on Monday occupied from 10 in the morning until 3:30 Thursday morning with the trial of Thomas Braid and Mary Braid Morrison, accused of the crimes of incest and murder, the victim, the child, being the fruit of their unnatural crime. The investigation was, of course, conducted with closed doors. The jury retired to consider their verdict a little past 2 o'clock, and returned at 10 minutes past 3, finding, by a plurality of voices, both parties guilty of the incest libelled, and on the second charge of murder they found, with the exception one dissenting voice, the female prisoner Mary Braid guilty, and the indictment against the remaining prisoner Thomas Braid not proven. Mr. Shaw Stewart, the part of the court, intimated that he restricted the libel insofar regarding the prisoner convicted of incest, Thomas Braid, after a most impressive address from Lord Meadowbank, during which the female prisoner fainted and had to be removed from the bar, was sentenced to transportation for life. During the whole of the address, the prisoner, Thomas Braid, behaved in the most indifferent manner, and at the interval when the female prisoner was removed, he said, "My innocence will protect me, I hope." In this bloody country I have got no justice. The female prisoner, Mary Braid, was then brought and seemed in such a state of dejection and debility that the court intimated that she might keep her seat while the sentence was pronouncing. His lordship then read the sentence of the court, ordaining the prisoner to be executed in the usual form on Monday, the 17th of February next. The female prisoner seemed from 40 to 45 years of age, but the male prisoner appeared several years younger. From the morning advertised as the 31st of January, 1834. Sentencing of Mary Braid. Lord Meadowbank addressed her, Mary Braid, as follows: "You have been convicted of the two dreadful crimes of incest and murder, of murder most foul and most unparalleled, committed upon the issues of your own body. I wish not to aggravate the situation in which you are placed. Every feeling of your heart, I am sure, must tell you how low you are sunk, and if you had witnessed what we have now witnessed, you would have felt how miserably you have been deluded by the paramour in your guilt. If he felt not for himself, he should have felt for you, at least, who are thus, probably though his means originally exercised, to be hurried to an ignominious death, but feeling he has none. And let me press upon you, therefore, if your mind is still lingering in the ties of affection in that quarter, that you break the tie at once, and turn yourself to the cultivation of that religion in which alone you can find consolation, and through which alone you can hope for mercy. Let me press and urge you to attend to those devout persons who will visit and give you all the benefit of their instructions. They will show you the way of devotion, and I most sincerely trust and pray their efforts may not be unavailing." From the infamous case of the Braids, brother and sister, we jump to 1836, and the case that rocked the parish, with the minister of the parish, loved and respected, having been found to have been carrying an illicit affair with his sister. From the Inverness Courier, December 1836. Shameful case of incest. A full, true, and particular account of that most extraordinary, shameful, and disgraceful case of incest between the minister of the parish of Logie in Rossshire and his own sister. She was seized with the pains of childbirth while playing at her piano on the 5th of November last, her brother being at the time assisting at the dispensation of the sacrament in a neighbouring parish, together with an account of his confession of the unnatural crime and his resignation of his holy office. The parish church of Logie in the county of Ross has again become vacant, and under circumstances of the most painful and awful description. As the case will soon come publicly before the presbytery, and as 100 idle reports, some of them implicating innocent persons in a neighbouring county, are afloat on the subject, we shall briefly recapitulate the facts. On the 5th of November last, Miss K, sister of the minister of the parish, who resided in the manse and superintended the domestic establishment, was suddenly taken ill while playing on the pianoforte. Her brother was absent, assisting to dispense the sacrament in another place, but aid was immediately procured. The young lady's illness continued to increase, and at length the grief and astonishment of those present, who never once suspected her condition, she was delivered of a child. She had made no preparation for the event, and she refused to give any information as to the paternity of the infant. About 10 days passed over when the minister disappeared, leaving his church and flock. No person knew whither he had gone, but in a short time the moderator of the presbytery received a letter from him, written from Aberdeen, acknowledging incestuous connection and resigning his living. The effect of such intelligence on the virtuous and religious inhabitants of that district we shall not attempt to describe. The unfortunate female who has participated in the unnatural guilt of her brother was pursued to the west coast, whither she had fled, was apprehended and brought last week to Dingwall. From the latter place she was conveyed in a chaise, accompanied by an officer and a female attendant, to Tain. But while the man left the vehicle for a few moments to wait upon the sheriff with an account of her apprehension or to receive fresh instructions, the offender and her attendant alighted from the chaise and escaped. We know not whether they have been closely pursued, but we sincerely trust that they will elude detection and thus prevent a trial which would be fraught with so much sorrow, shame, and disgrace.
Case 5. The highly disturbing case of the Reverend Wetherell, 1845. Another rogue reverend, but equally sinister. This major scandal of 1845 involved the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, his daughter, and the new husband of his daughter. Oxford educated the Reverend Mr. Wetherell in his youth was fortunate to marry very well. The couple had a daughter before the wife sadly passed, leaving her significant inheritance to her daughter. Years passed. With the Reverend Wetherell's expensive taste, his daughter comes into her inheritance, and, with his daughter's permission, the Reverend Wetherell burns through the inheritance in only a few years. The daughter, against her father's wishes, finds a respectable man who has just become an attorney. The new husband is shocked and dismayed to find that serious debts in the name of the purportedly wealthy young woman he has married are now laid at his door. As he attempts to understand just what he has gotten himself into, a highly torrid and salacious story emerges regarding the Reverend Wetherell and his daughter. From the Illustrated Police News, the 22nd of November, the Reverend C. Wetherell. The infamous case of Cook versus Wetherell was a case of alleged incest, and one of so revolting a character that one would prefer to pass it over in silence and let it sink into oblivion, were it not for the fact that it is a crime of not uncommon occurrence, which is frequently engendered by the covetousness of the age. The delinquent in this case had neither the excuse of poverty nor the circumstance arising from the overcrowding and indiscriminate herding of the sexes together. On the contrary, he was a man of education and of wealth, and a minister of the Church of England, who ought, by his example and his call to a purity of living, to have been not only a protector to his own child, but to all around him. The Reverend C. Wetherell, who was born in the year 1790, was educated at Oxford and afterwards became a clerk in holy orders. In early life he came to reside in London, and being highly respectably connected, he married a daughter of the then Lord Mayor of London. Through his father-in-law's influence, he obtained the rectory of Byfield in Northamptonshire, and he also had with his wife a fortune of £20,000, worth approximately £2,100,000 in 2024, the use of which, however, was vested in her for life. In the year 1819, a daughter was born of the marriage, but her mother dying before she came of age, she willed the whole of her property to her. When the daughter was 22 years of age, she became acquainted with a Mr. John Mind Cook, a young man, an attorney, and also very respectably connected, the son of Mr. Cook of Capel Court in Hertfordshire. As her father objected to the proposed marriage, the young people were in opposition to his wishes, and they privately married at St. George's Church in Hanover Square in 1842. Mr. Cook expected a large fortune with his wife, but shortly after their return from their wedding tour, a series of circumstances arose which led to the revelations in the trial annexed. The action came on at Croydon on the 15th of August 1845 before Lord Chief Justice Tyndall and a common jury. The case was one of the most extraordinary on record, and the damages were laid at £50,000, worth approximately £7,600,000 in 2024. Mr. Sergeant Shee opened the case and said that the plaintiff, Mr. Cook, was a young man who came into court to complain of the most serious injury that could be inflicted by one man against the other, an injury which had embittered the early mornings of his life, which must deprive him of happiness thereafter. The defendant, the Reverend C. Wetherell, was a man of 55 years of age, and at the present time rector of Byfield, and when he told them that he was charged with incest and adultery with his own daughter, he was sure the jury would give him credit for feeling the deep responsibility of his task in having to lay such a case before them. At the death of the defendant, the Reverend Wetherell's wife, the young lady's fortune settled on her by her mother was vested for her in the hands of a trustee till she became of age. But when she became of age, it was transferred to her in her own name and to be used in her own right. Her father, the Reverend Wetherell, at this time took a splendid mansion in Eaton Square, where he lived in a style of great splendour and far above his means. It would appear that the young lady's money was, with her consent, by degrees drawn from the Bank of England, and eventually all squandered away within 2 years of the young lady's coming of age. About this time, in the year 1842, when her money was all gone, she got married to the plaintiff, Mr. Cook, who had just been admitted as an attorney and had his own right a fortune of £8,000, the value of £1,100,000 in 2024. After the return from their wedding tour, the young couple went to visit the Reverend Mr. Wetherell at his rectory at Byfield, where Mr. Cook was then more friendlily received. In 1842, the legal owner of the woman, the father or the husband, was liable for the woman's debts. So, Mr. Cook, who thought he was marrying a wealthy heiress, has found himself with large debts incurred. It would seem that whilst she was under her father's care, the Reverend Wetherell had bought on credit and utterly depleted her inheritance, all with the complicity of his daughter, who had signed for the purchases against her inheritance. Basically, they bought on credit with the daughter's inheritance as assurance. To add to this, before the legal marriage took place, the Reverend Wetherell again, with the agreement and complicity of his daughter, further bought on credit, which, when payment was due, was now sent to the daughter's new husband, Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook would be responsible for the debts that had been incurred by the Reverend Wetherell through Wetherell's daughter, the new Mrs. Cook. But 2 or 3 days had elapsed when a gentleman named Nisbet made his appearance and produced an acceptance of Miss Wetherell's for the payment of £500, value of £70,000 in 2024, and he insisted on his right to look to the newly married husband for payment. The plaintiff, Mr. Cook, was shocked at the news, for he felt that he had been cruelly deceived, both by his wife and her father. He knew that he was legally liable for the debts of his wife, and he therefore felt that it was absolutely necessary for him to ascertain the exact amount of her liabilities and the real position of her affairs. The result of his inquiries satisfied him that his wife was dreadfully involved. All her fortune had been squandered, and she had acceptances out to a large amount. He then felt that it was only due to himself that her father should give an account of his stewardship, and that he should grant him an interview for that purpose. This took place, and the defendant, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, then admitted that he had wasted his daughter's fortune, and that she had nothing left, and that the furniture, houses, and everything that they had made over by a bill of sale or warrant of attorney to different parties who had advanced money upon them. From this time, Mr. Wetherell offered him every obstruction in obtaining his rights, and his wife invariably took the part of her father in resisting his wishes. Mr. Cook is upset that he has been handed large debts without his knowledge, and based on some of the debt knowingly accumulated whilst the two were engaged, so that the debt would have to be paid by himself. In speaking to his new wife, she takes the side of her father, and the marriage breaks down terribly. It is only through an intermediary that she allows herself to be convinced to do her duty and to follow her husband to London, far from her father. But the relationship is broken, and she pines to be back in her father's house, where she eventually returns. Under the roof of her father, she refuses to have anything to do with her new husband. After having coldly and unwillingly accompanied her husband to London from Byfield, she eventually returned to her father, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, and although the plaintiff, Mr. Cook, repeatedly, in the most earnest and affectionate manner, entreated her to return to him, she invariably refused, and treated him with the utmost coldness and unkindness. Astounded at the rapid breakdown, Mr. Cook begins to investigate to try to understand what has happened. Through interviews with servants and investigations at hotels, he discovers a horrible truth. The truth leads him to his only viable legal option, to sue the father of his wife for alienating his wife's affections, a Georgian Victorian legal term for an illicit intimacy or affair. He should be able to show that the defendant, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, had made the most shameful charges against his daughter's husband. Mr. Cook and the Reverend Wetherell in time succeeded in entirely alienating her affections from his client, Mr. Cook. There was, in fact, a total absence of anything like that feeling which could be expected to animate the breast of a young woman towards a man to whom she had been married only 2 months. Mr. Cook was at length compelled to take proceedings in Chancery, and eventually a deed was executed by which the defendant, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, admitted that he was indebted to his daughter in the sum of £18,000. value of £2,750,000 in 2024, and that large arrears were due to her, and he undertook to repay the amount by yearly instalments of £500, the value of £76,000 in 2024. But to show that Mr. Cook had acted in a perfectly disinterested manner, he, Mr. Cook, did not take any interest under the deed, but the whole amount was placed under the control and appointment of his wife. Mr. Cook legally is able to prove that Mr. Wetherell has basically used all of his daughter's inheritance, so with her own complicity, and is legally required to pay it back incrementally. Mr. Cook absolves himself from any financial gain from the matter, with the money to go directly to his wife. The debt issue now resolved legally, the Reverend Wetherell bans Mr. Cook from visiting his house in which his daughter now resides. She will have nothing to do with her new husband, Mr. Cook. Not understanding her hostility after he has managed to legally to obtain her inheritance back for her, his investigations discover an unexpected, sordid explanation. Immediately after this deed was executed, the defendant, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, wrote a letter to Mr. Cook forbidding him into his house or having any communication with his daughter, Mr. Cook's wife. During the whole time, the plaintiff's wife, Mr. Wetherell's daughter, also evinced the utmost hostility to him and opposed him in every proceeding he adopted. The plaintiff, Mr. Cook, could not account for such conduct, but at length he received some information which induced the most horrible impression on his mind, and his subsequent inquiries led to the present charge being made against the defendant. He should call before the jury the servants in the house in Eaton Square, and they would prove that they always entertained a suspicion of the character of the intimacy between the defendant, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, and his daughter, and that, having watched, they were satisfied that they were in the habit of continually sleeping together as man and wife. He should prove that the defendant, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, was seen at all hours of the night in his daughter's bedroom, clearly naked, and she in the same state. He should also be able to show that this state of things existed at Byford, and he also should show that they slept together as man and wife at the Beaufort Arms at Chepstow. If he proved this, then he was sure that the jury would not consider any damages too large, or that any sum could be sufficient reparation for the injury that he had received. The following evidence was then adduced. Mr. William Hastings Reed said, "I know the plaintiff, Mr. Cook, in this action, and was present at his marriage with Miss Wetherell. Shortly after the marriage, I called on the defendant at Mivert's Hotel for the purpose of asking some particulars of his daughter's property and the liabilities the plaintiff, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, had incurred as her husband. I also wished to have some information respecting the accommodation bill. The defendant, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, told me that a great portion of her fortune had been expended in purchasing furniture for the house at Eaton Square and the house at Byfield. The defendant, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, mentioned something to me about an accommodation bill for £550, which his daughter had accepted for him, and added that it was secured either by a warrant of attorney or a bill of sale. The houses, as they have been purchased by the daughter against her inheritance, and now the property of Mr. Cook, where he expects to reside with his wife. He goes to the house only to find that he is not let in by Mr. Wetherell. Mr. Wetherell counters that he has signed a long-term lease allowing him to reside in the properties. Mr. Cook is forced to give up pursuing the house. I called a second time when I met Mr. Nisbet, Mr. Wetherell's solicitor, and the defendant said that by advice he should decline entering into further particulars. On the same evening, Mr. Cook sent his man Johnson to take possession of the house in Eaton Place, and I called there the same evening with Mr. Cook. The defendant, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, and Mr. Nisbet, his attorney, then came to the house while we were there. They rang the bell and demanded entrance, but they were not let in. On the following morning, in consequence of an intimation from the police, Mr. Cook and myself attended the police court in Queen's Square, and Mr. Nisbet complained that Mr. Wetherell had been deprived of the possession of his house and property, and he produced a lease. Eventually, the magistrate said he should order possession to be given up, and Mr. Cook accordingly gave directions to his servant to give up possession. Mr. Cook now attempts to get his wife back, hoping possibly that under his influence he can make some progress with the associated property under her name, as well as returning to their former affectionate relationship. He makes little headway. Upon this same evening, Mr. Cook and I and a gentleman named Waddy went down to Byfield Rectory. Mr. Wetherell was there, and after some little parley, Mr. Cook was admitted alone, but I could hear what took place inside the house, although I was not admitted. There was an angry discussion, and Mr. Cook said he came to demand his wife, and he was anxious she should accompany him back to London. Witness heard her voice, and amidst the quarrelling going on inside, she appeared to take part with her father. The plaintiff, Mr. Cook, then came out and said that under the circumstances, perhaps he had better go back to London without her. Mr. Waddy and I then saw her, and after some persuasion, she returned back to London with us. I afterwards, with Mr. Waddy, reproached Mrs. Cook for her coldness and unkindness to her husband. It was through an intimate friend of mine that Miss Wetherell was introduced to Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook was 23 or 24 years old when he was married. Mr. G.K. Caulfield examined. I am a solicitor, and I know the defendant, Mr. Wetherell. After his daughter's marriage, I noted as her solicitor, and I believe when she became Mrs. Cook, she was in debt upon different liabilities, acceptances and warrants of attorney to the amount of between £1,300 and £1,400, the value of £206,000 in 2024. I remember being sent one evening to Myvert's Hotel, where I saw the defendant, the Reverend Wetherell, and Mrs. Cook. I know that at that time Mr. Cook was very anxious for an interview with his wife. It had been arranged that they should meet and have an interview together, but this was frustrated by Mr. Wetherell taking his daughter away. During the unhappy differences between Mr. and Mrs. Cook, the defendant, the Reverend Mr. Wetherell, appeared anxious to retire at conciliation, and in all the conversations I had with him, he spoke in a most disgraceful terms of Mr. Cook, and on the very first interview with him, he made an accusation against him of a most scandalous character. From here, the court case begins to unveil proof after proof of the alleged incestuous relationship between the Reverend Mr. Wetherell and his daughter. Eleanor Williams, examined, said, "I was formerly chambermaid at the Beaufort Arms at Chepstow, and I am now in the same capacity at the Umner Hotel in Bristol. I remember a lady and a gentleman coming to the Beaufort Arms about 2 years ago, and they stayed there about 2 nights. There was only one bed in the room, and they occupied it. I came to London afterwards, and I went to the Queen's Bench prison. I there saw the same gentleman I had seen at the Beaufort Arms. I went the next morning to the chapel in the prison, and there I saw the same lady and gentleman together. I'm sure the defendant and his daughter were the same gentleman and lady who slept together in the same bed at the Beaufort Arms." Mrs. Elizabeth Russell, examined, said, "I am a married woman and my husband is a gentleman's servant. We both entered the defendant's service in 1843. The defendant and his daughter used to go backwards and forwards from Byfield, and my husband had orders not to allow Mr. Cook to enter the house. The bedrooms occupied by the defendant and his daughter were adjoining each other, and the doors were close together. After I had been in the defendant's service a week, I saw the defendant coming out of his daughter's bedroom at 2 in the morning and running at about 5:30 o'clock. He had only his dressing gown on. I've also seen Mrs. Cook go into her father's bedroom with nothing but her nightdress and a dressing gown on. It was my duty to make the beds, but when I first went, Mrs. Cook always told me that her father always made his own bed, and I used to make hers for her. My husband used to help me make the beds. From what I have seen, I had suspicions, and the appearance of the bed of the defendant's daughter had always led me to the belief that 2 persona slept in it. Testimony is brought forward implying that the daughter became pregnant whilst living with her father, and that the child was got rid of during a trip away with the 2 of them. The witness then detailed a number of other circumstances which are not of a character to be printed. Previous to August in 1843, the defendant's daughter got very stout, as she could not get her dresses together. She then said that her papa should dress her, as he could do it without tearing her dresses. The defendant and his daughter then went away for 10 days, and when they came back, the defendant's daughter was very much thinner, and she had all the appearances which led her to believe she had had a miscarriage, as she was so pale. She then asked the Reverend's daughter whether she had not had to go for a doctor, to which she replied, "My papa is always my doctor." Margaret Hall, a washerwoman, examined the next, gave evidence, but her evidence was not fit for publication. Mrs. Langridge stated that she was in the defendant's service at their house in 1842. She had frequently seen the defendant and his daughter go into each other's rooms with nothing on but their nightdresses and dressing gowns, and remains for 2 or 3 hours at a time. He had also seen the defendant kiss his daughter in a most indecent manner. Other servants then gave a corroborative evidence. Lord Chief Justice Tyndall then summed up the case and left it for the jury to say whether the facts had been substantiated or whether it was a base conspiracy to obtain a divorce. The jury retired for a short time and then returned into court with a verdict for the plaintiff, Mr. Cook, and damages to the amount of £8,000, worth approximately £1.2 million in 2024. There seemed to be a general opinion on the part of the press at the time that the jury, with the evidence before them, could have come to no other conclusion. It was admitted too by some of the chief writers of the age that as chroniclers of events, this was one of the most stupendous crimes it had ever been their painful duty to record. Case 6. Agnes Norman, 1871. In Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian times, it was not unusual for children, especially girls as young as 14, to be sent out to work. Such was the case of Agnes Norman, who ended up being a prolific serial killer whose targets were those who were unable to defend themselves, infants, children, and various pets.
From the Illustrated Police News, May 1871, the extraordinary charge of child murder. On Thursday afternoon at the Lambeth Police Court, Agnes Norman was again placed in the dock, charged with the murder of Jessie Jane Beer, an infant. The deceased child died from suffocation during the temporary absence of his parents, and the appearance of the body having given rise to suspicion, the girl was arrested. At the last hearing, Mr. Poland, who was conducting the case on behalf of the Treasury, called evidence to show that in other houses where the defendant lived as a domestic servant, children had died in an unaccountable manner, and that birds, fish, cats and dogs had shared the same fate. The prisoner appeared calm and collected, but seemed to have suffered in health from the position in which she was placed. Reports have Agnes Norman born in 1856 in Northamptonshire. We have few details of Agnes, nor have we been able to source a picture of her. In 1860, she and her mother moved to London. In January 1869, at the age of 13 or 14, Agnes was placed into service in the household of Ralph Milner. Her mother had set up the employment for her. From the trial testimony of Mrs. Elizabeth Milner, when Agnes Norman entered her service, her mother stated she was about 15 years of age. Mrs. Milner had 4 children, respectively, 8, 6, 2.5 years and 10 months. All were in perfectly good health. Mrs. Milner was in the habit of going out as an envelope folder every day, and on February 10th she went out, leaving Agnes with the 4 children. When she returned in the evening, she found the youngest child, Thomas, quite dead. He was lying on the bed. A fortnight afterwards, on the 24th of February, the witness again went out, leaving the children with Agnes. At about 7:30 in the evening, when she returned, she found Minnie, aged 2.5, dead. About 10 days after that, Agnes was once again left in charge of the 2 remaining children. Upon Mrs. Milner's return, the boy, named Arthur, was insensible and remained so. On coming to himself, the boy told his mother, Mrs. Milner, several things, in consequence of which Mrs. Milner called Agnes and asked her what she had done to the children in her absence. Mrs. Milner asked Agnes if it was true that she had shut up Minnie in a wardrobe and tried to frighten Arthur about a ghost, but Agnes made no answer. Mrs. Milner accordingly discharged her, telling her at the same time that she believed she could put her in prison, although she had not sufficient evidence to charge her with murder. Mrs. Taylor's baby. Agnes Norman went into service to a Mrs. Gardner living in Stockwell from the 21st of April 1870. A Mrs. Fanny Taylor reported going to see Mrs. Gardner upon the 1st of May. She brought her infant, who was 5 months old, a very strong and healthy child, with her. Mrs. Taylor put the child to bed at 8:20 in the evening. The baby was fast asleep. At 11:15, Mrs. Gardner and Mrs. Taylor went into the room to check on the baby. The baby was in the same position as when they had left it, but it was quite dead. Mrs. Gardner's child. On the 19th of May, 1870, Mrs. Gardner went out in the evening, leaving her child, James Alexander, aged 15 months, in his cot. When she returned at 8 o'clock in the evening, the child was dead. Also, whilst Agnes was in service with the Gardner family, 6 or 8 birds, 2 cats, a dog, a dozen goldfish, and a parrot were found dead. In August 1870, Agnes enters the service of Mr. Brown, staying a fortnight. The testimony of Elizabeth Parfitt regarding the attempted murder of Charles Parfitt. August 1870. Elizabeth Parfitt at 19 Temple Street, Newington, said her nephew Charles, a boy of 10, lived with her there. His health was perfectly good. He slept in the same room with her, and on one day in August she left him in bed. Agnes Norman was then a servant there. After being downstairs an hour, she heard a stifled cry, and going up she found Agnes in the act of getting off the bed. The boy was crying and in a state of agitation. Agnes remarked that he must have been dreaming. The boy at once denied this and said that Helen, her real name, Agnes, had been trying to strangle him. Agnes said in reply that it was untrue, upon which the lad pointed to his mouth and throat. He had a sweet in his mouth, which he said Agnes had given him not to cry. The boy's lips afterwards were very sore, and his glands much swollen. Elizabeth Parfitt had heard. Agnes says that she was not very fond of children. Agnes left the house a day or two afterwards. On April the 4th, 1871, Agnes enters a service into the household of Mr. Beer. The witness, John James Beer, a jeweller and a dealer at 58 Newington Butts, deposed. He said that the prisoner entered his service on the 4th of April as a general servant, and she had to look after his 3 children, the youngest, Jessie, being 15 months old. She was in his service for a week in all. On the 7th of April, he and his wife went out to see some friends and left their children in the charge of the prisoner, Agnes Norman. They, the children, then being in good health. He and his wife started at 2:45 in the afternoon and returned shortly before midnight. They found Agnes in an armchair in the sitting room, apparently asleep. She got up as they went in. His wife asked how the children were, and Agnes replied they were very well. After being in the room a few minutes, he heard one of the children crying. They all slept in a room above, which it was usual to lock, there being some lodgers in the house. He went up and unlocked the door and found his second child, a boy of 3 years of age, lying on the floor, as if he had fallen out of bed. There was no light in the room. He put the boy in bed again and felt surprised that the baby, who was a very wakeful child, had slept through the noise. He found on feeling her that she was lying on her back close to the wall, with the clothes thrown off her. Her head was near the pillow and close to the wall. The mattress was wider than the bed, but there was no hollow in which the child could have fallen. She appeared to have kicked off her bedclothes, being very strong in her limbs. He took hold of her legs and found she was dead. His wife, being called up, took the body into the sitting room, and the prisoner Agnes, who was there, was in no way concerned. Agnes said in reply to a question that she last saw the child alive at 10:30, when it was sleeping in the middle of the bed. Mr. Beers on that told her he did not believe her, to which she made no reply. Mr. Lees, a surgeon in the Walworth Road, deposed that the child died of suffocation. On the surface of the lower lip there were 2 white marks, which might have been caused by the child being pressed against a bed. He believed that the marks had been made during life, and that the pressure continued until shortly before death. On the 29th of April, Agnes Norman, now 15 years of age, was taken before the magistrates at Lambeth Police Court, with a trial date set for the 10th of July, 1871, at the Old Bailey. In recounting the coincidental deaths in all the places she was employed, the count was as follows. All in all, 5 children dead. 1 child was 2.5 years old, 3 children were 15 months, 1 child was 10 months, 1 child was 5 months. In addition to these deaths, 1 child aged 6 was found insensible, but eventually came round with medical care. Also, there was 1 accusation of attempted murder of a 10-year-old boy by strangulation. The initial charges of murder to Agnes Norman were 5 charges of death to children, starting with what the prosecution considered to be their strongest case, the murder of Jessie Jane Beer. Also, the attempted murder of Charles Parfitt, the 10-year-old boy. The jury found Agnes Norman not guilty of the murder of Jessie Jane Beer, as it could not be proven beyond doubt that the child did not die of natural causes. Once the verdict of not guilty was found for Jessie Beer, the prosecution decided not to proceed with the 4 other children's death cases. However, they did pursue the charge of the attempted murder of Charles Parfitt, then aged 10, by strangulation. The evidence of Charles Parfitt, now 11 years old, in August 1870. Charles lived with his uncle, Mr. Brown, in St. George's Road, attending a school near Windsor. He remembered Agnes Norman, but knew her as Helen. One night, while visiting his uncle during a school holiday, he was awakened in the night by feeling something hurting him. Upon looking up, he saw Agnes Norman, known to him as Helen, on the bed. One of her hands was on his mouth and the other on his throat. He felt as if he was being strangled, and he tried to get up. He tried to make a noise, but could not. She gave him a sweet and asked him not to cry. His aunt came into the room, and Agnes, known as Helen, was on his bed. He told his aunt that Helen had been trying to choke him, and on getting into Mr. Brown's room he felt a soreness in his throat and his lip was swollen. The jury returned a verdict of guilty with a recommendation to mercy on the grounds of the prisoner's youth. From the Morpeth Herald, August 1871, the sentencing of Agnes Norman. At the Central Criminal Court on Monday, Agnes Norman, aged 15, domestic servant, was brought up to receive sentence on a charge of attempting to strangle a little boy named Parfitt. The prisoner was last indicted for having murdered 5 children, but as the first charge of murder failed, the rest were abandoned. The trial for attempting to strangle resulted in her conviction. The common sergeant before whom she was tried remarked on the extraordinary circumstances of her case. the death of children, dogs, cats, and other animals having literally followed in the wake of her servitude, and for the offences of which she had been found guilty, she was sentenced to 10 years penal servitude. She received sentence with the same stolid, vacant demeanour that characterized her behaviour throughout the child. All in all, Agnes Norman is suspected to have killed 5 children in her care and attempted to kill 2 other children, but was unsuccessful in those attempts. For the murder of Jane Beer, verdict not guilty. For the attempted murder of Charles Parfitt, verdict guilty. Agnes Norman was sentenced to 10 years in prison and spent time in Martlesham, Woking and Manchester prisons.
Case 7. The Clitheroe Case, 1891. We finish this crime compilation with a slightly more light-hearted story. Wealthy heiress Emily Maud Hall is being avidly pursued by Edmund Horton Jackson, who is not as fortunately financial. Emily, with some reluctance and no small measure of buyer's remorse, weds the insistent Mr. Horton, but there everything stops. They do not consummate the marriage, and indeed Emily moves back to her own house and has little to do with the redoubtable Mr. Jackson, thereby ensuring that he has little access to her considerable funds. All this changes when Emily, in the presence of her sister, as they are about to attend service, is abducted by her husband and 3 of his friends. She is stuffed into a waiting cab with force as she attempts to defend herself against her attackers. The 3, with a forcibly subdued Mrs. Jackson, then whisks her away and imprisons her against her will. Such was the infamous Clitheroe case that gripped the papers and the public in 1891. This famous case came to more clearly define the right or not of a husband upon his wife. Background. Emily Maud Hall. Emily Maud Hall, the youngest of 3 daughters born to Henry Hall, a moderately successful solicitor in Clitheroe in Lancashire, led a quiet and moderately privileged life. In 1860, at the age of 15, Emily witnessed her eldest sister's marriage to Hartley Baldwin, her father-in-law's partner. This union appeared to solidify familial and professional ties. Meanwhile, her other sister chose a different path, remaining unmarried. In 1881, Emily herself was still unwed at 36, seemingly destined for a life of spinsterhood, a common fate for many women of her era who found themselves on the fringes of matrimonial prospects. The death of their father in 1875 marked a turning point for the Hall sisters, each inheriting an equal portion of his estate. For Emily Maud Hall, this bequest translated into an annual income of £600, a sum roughly equivalent to £87,000 in 2024. Despite this financial independence, the bond between the sisters remained unbroken. Following their mother's death in 1878, Emily and her older sister continued to reside in their parental home. Meanwhile, the Baldwin family, linked through the marriage of Emily's eldest sister to Hartley Baldwin, settled nearby. Friendship or romance? In the summer of 1881, at the age of 36, Emily Maud Hall's life took an unexpected turn during a picnic when she encountered Edmund Horton Jackson, who she referred to as Horton in her correspondence. As the youngest son of a naval officer and the brother of a colonel, Horton presented himself as an entirely fitting match for the daughter of a solicitor. Horton's lack of visible employment led Emily to surmise that he was living upon his means, suggesting a man of independent wealth. For several years following their initial encounter in 1881, Emily Maud Hall and Edmund Horton Jackson frequently crossed paths at social gatherings. In her memoirs published after the 1891 trial, Emily maintained that she regarded Horton merely as a friend and social acquaintance during this period, despite his persistent advances. According to Emily, Horton behaved like a suitor, proposing marriage on multiple occasions, proposals she consistently declined due to a lack of romantic feeling. Horton, however, suggested that her refusals stemmed from the disapproval of her sisters and brother-in-law rather than an absence of mutual affection. New Zealand. In October 1887, Emily Maud Hall faced a pivotal moment when she learned of Edmund Horton Jackson's plans to emigrate to New Zealand with his close friend Dixon Robinson to pursue farming. Confused about his departure, Emily finally agreed to marry him. Her resolve, however, wavered, and within 2 days she called off the engagement, daunted by the prospect of marrying a man bound for distant shores. Jackson, indignant along with Robinson, reproached her for what they perceived as a lack of courage, leading to a heated argument between Emily and Horton. Yet, just 2 days later, Jackson reached out to her with a conciliatory letter pleading for her to reconsider. This olive branch mended their rift. More significantly, Jackson managed to sway Emily once more, painting a vivid and optimistic picture of their future together in New Zealand. Hesitatingly, Emily agreed to marry him. The couple were wed on November the 5th, 1887. Relationship difficulties. Immediately, their marriage was marked by an unusual separation. Emily steadfastly refused to live with her husband for 4 years. Despite his numerous entreaties and a court ruling in his favour for the restitution of conjugal rights in 1889. Under English law at the time, defiance of such an order could have resulted in imprisonment. However, the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1884 had abolished this penalty. Thus, when Emily and Edmund Jackson found themselves locked in this domestic standoff, Jackson was left with little recourse. Emily held onto her unwavering resistance. From the Newcastle Evening Chronicle, the 10th of March 1891, the capture of a wife. Extraordinary affair in Lancashire. An extraordinary sensation has been caused in Blackburn, Clitheroe, and other towns of northeast Lancashire by the seizure under peculiar circumstances of a wife who refused to return to her husband. The lady is Mrs. Jackson, wife of Mr. E.H. Jackson, who was married to her at St. Paul's in Blackburn in 1887. She was Miss Hall of Clitheroe, and is understood to possess a fortune of £27,000, worth of over £4 million in 2024. The marriage appears to have been without the knowledge or consent of the lady's relatives. On the wedding day, Mr. Jackson left his bride and travelled to London, sailed almost immediately to Australia, and they corresponded affectionately for some time, but after a long absence on the part of her husband, Mrs. Jackson appears to have become somewhat indifferent towards him, and when he returned early in 1889 to take her to his new home, she refused to meet him. A good deal of litigation followed, resulting in the husband obtaining an order from the High Court for the restitution of conjugal rights. Mrs. Jackson, however, persisted in her refusal to live with her husband and continued to live as she had done during his absence with her sister, Miss Hall, at Clitheroe. Continuing to fail in his endeavour to bring his wife to him, Mr. Jackson appears to have formed the idea of seizing her and forcibly carrying her off when an opportunity occurred. Accordingly, he had a carriage in readiness outside Clitheroe Parish Church on Sunday morning, and knowing that Mrs. Jackson with her friends were attending the morning service there, he, with 3 male friends, lay in wait for her. As soon as she appeared, accompanied by a married sister, Mrs. Baldwin, Mr. Jackson alighted from the carriage and, seizing his wife, forced her, with the assistance of 2 of his companions, into the vehicle. She was not captured, however, without a severe struggle, but it was a very short one, and as far as it can be ascertained, Mr. Jackson was the chief sufferer, blood flowing from a wound on his face. Directly the captive was in the carriage, the driver whipped up the horses, and the vehicle started off at great speed in the direction of Blackburn. Early on Sunday afternoon, the carriage dashed up to the door of a house in one of the suburbs of Blackburn. The 3 gentlemen and Mrs. Jackson alighted and were immediately admitted to the house, the door of which was then instantly secured on the inside. About an hour later, a second vehicle, which also had been driven hard, arrived outside the same dwelling. It contained some of Mrs. Jackson's relatives and Mr. Baldwin, the family solicitor. The latter alighted and knocked loudly, but was refused admittance. This action on the part of those inside greatly incensed the newcomers, who threatened action, legal and otherwise. The excited doings on the doorstep caused a crowd to gather, which increased in numbers till several hundred people were collected. The excitement became much greater, and a breach of the peace must almost inevitably have resulted had not the chief constable of Blackburn arrived with a number of constables. Mr. Baldwin appealed to him for his assistance in effecting an entrance to the house, but the chief constable refused to take such action, pointing out that it would be illegal. He also dissuaded the irate lawyer from attempting to take the house by storm with the help of some of his friends. Meantime, the parties within the house firmly refused to admit anyone or to deliver up Mrs. Jackson, and her husband declared he would meet with force any attempt to rescue her. The lady's relatives outside accordingly set a watch on the house, and this was kept up during the whole of the night, in spite of the heavy snow and the bitter cold east wind. Finally, Mr. Baldwin returned to Clitheroe to obtain a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Jackson and his assistants for the alleged assault on Mrs. Baldwin. It was stated that the assault took place at the time that Mrs. Jackson was captured, Mrs. Baldwin having fainted during the scuffle at the church gates. The warrants were obtained and brought to Blackburn, but no arrests could be made, as the gentleman remained in the house. Yesterday morning found all the parties in the same condition, the besiegers maintaining a resolute watch, while the besieged kept guard upon their fort at all parts where an attack might be expected. A crowd of lookers-on gathered again as the day advanced, and the people took the liveliest interest in the proceedings. The police, however, were in force all the time, and, as the chief constable had expressed his intention of arresting anyone who broke the peace, the besiegers contented themselves with maintaining a cordon around the dwelling, with the evident intention of recapturing Mrs. Jackson if opportunity offered, or of arresting the garrison on the warrants already procured, should they venture beyond the house. Once or twice during the day the lady was seen at the window, but she vanished almost immediately. The curiosity of the crowd was roused almost to fever heat at each of her appearances. If the besieger had intended to starve the garrison into surrender, They had evidently not reckoned upon the resources of modern civilization. Mr. Jackson's house is connected with the telephone exchange, and by this means, during the day, he gave numerous orders to tradesmen for the necessaries and some of the luxuries of life. On arriving at the house, the tradesmen awaited while the garrison lowered a basket attached to a rope from one of the upper windows, and thus the beleaguered were rapidly provisioned. Last night there was no change in the situation. Those without maintaining a stolid watch, and the gallant trio within the fort keeping a constant watch upon their foes in the street. The two associates of Mr. Jackson against whom warrants were issued are Mr. Dixon Robinson and Dr. Robinson. The Central News representative interviewed Mr. Jackson last evening by means of the telephone. Mr. Jackson asserted that, having both right and law on his side, he should continue in the course he had elected to follow. If necessary, he could hold out against his enemies for a month, for he had ample means to provision the citadel. All comers would be refused admittance, and on no account would the defenders unbar the door or window. He had no knowledge of what action his wife's relatives intended to take. All he knew was that he had at length secured his wife, and he meant to keep her. No opportunities was afforded of learning the views of the imprisoned lady. The situation today. This morning, the situation in the startling abduction case in Blackburn remained unchanged. But extraordinary developments are expected hourly. The police have kept guard over the house all night, but so bitter has been the cold that the officers have had to be relieved every 2 hours. The besiegers have also remained at their posts, no single interval being allowed during which the defenders could escape unobserved. Last night, Mr. Jackson stated on the telephone that his wife during the day had been most obstinate and helpless, and that towards evening she had commenced to talk a little. Telephonic communications were kept up with Clitheroe, Blackburn, and Colonel Jackson in London throughout the day. It was rumoured that 100 men were marching from Clitheroe yesterday to attack the house. The chief constable immediately massed an equal number of officers on the spot, and the Clitheroe contingent were made aware of this by the lady's friends and did not arrive. Messrs. Robinson, who assisted in the abduction, has been recommended by their father, a prominent solicitor residing at Clitheroe Castle, to surrender so that the case might come into court, but this they have so far declined to do. The chief constable has informed Mr. Jackson that the law will permit him to effect a forcible entrance into the house in 2 days. It is understood that the reason the gentlemen do not wish to surrender is not that they shun a trial, but that they do quite not know what would happen to Mrs. Jackson if they were arrested. Her relations might seize her and carry her back, but to prevent this, Mr. Jackson has engaged a large force of men to enter the house the moment he and his abettors are arrested. It is this plan that the police dread, for in all likelihood there will be a free and most dangerous fight. Mr. Jackson is an aristocratic-looking man, above medium height, with iron grey hair and face bronzed with the heat of foreign climates. His wife is short, with a comely round face and fresh complexion. The Central News Blackburn correspondent telegraphs throughout yesterday Mrs. Jackson persistently refused to speak to her captors, nor would she take any food. The shock of the seizure has unnerved her a good deal, but towards midnight she was willing to talk a little. The press and public are all agog with how the case will end. There is much speculation in the papers, with some saying that she had reconciled with her husband and others stating that she was desperate to escape him. The case brought up the question, can a husband kidnap a wife? Or does she already belong to him? Did a husband have the right to imprison his wife? Emily's sisters find legal representation and request a writ of habeas corpus as a court order. This would require that the respondent, Houghton, must produce Emily in court. From the Newcastle Evening Chronicle, the 19th of March 1891, the Clitheroe abduction case, hearing in London today. The hearing of the Rule Nisi for a writ of habeas corpus directed to Mr. E. H. Jackson to produce his wife came on for hearing in London before the Lord Chancellor this morning. The court was crowded and many ladies had seats on the bench and behind counsel. At the opening of the court, Mr. Jackson sat next to his solicitor. He is apparently about 45 years of age, but his hair is grey. As soon as the judges took their seats, Mrs. Jackson entered and sat by herself in a chair placed in front of the bar. She was quietly dressed, wearing a seal-skinned jacket and black bonnet. She looked pale and anxious. Mr. Collins said he would enter into the cause of detention. He detailed the circumstances of the marriage and declared that the journey of her husband to New Zealand was with the lady's agreement. When he returned, Mr. Jackson was denied access to his wife and could get no answer to letters. He alleged no misconduct whatever against his wife. An affidavit by the husband read, stating that since his wife's detention, everything had been done for her comfort and happiness. She had read newspapers, had been amused at the report of the case, she had played the piano and sung to him. He believed that if she were left alone by her relatives, she could regain her love and sympathy, which he had done nothing to forfeit. Affidavits from the friends of the husband who aided in the abduction were also read. Dr. Martin of Blackburn said he was present when the parties were married. After the ceremony, Mrs. Jackson said she was glad it was all over, as her own groom had been put to watch her movements. The groom had attended Mrs. Jackson since the detention. She had in no way suffered in health. The only complaint she had made to him was that her husband had removed her bonnet and threw it into the fire. As far as he had seen, Mr. Jackson had treated his wife with every kindness. The nurse employed to wait on the lady corroborated. Mr. Collins concluded the affidavits, contending that the husband had the common law right to take possession of his wife and confine her to prevent her continuing permanently from his society. Arguments then proceeded as to what really constituted imprisonment. Mr. Collins asserted that the wife had the free rein of the house and could drive out in his carriage if she wished. He urged that the husband had a right under the circumstances to seize his wife. After further lengthy arguments, the judges expressed a wish to see Mrs. Jackson privately and to satisfy themselves that she was a perfectly free agent in what she had done in appearing by her counsel, Mr. Finlay. The lady was accordingly shown into their lordships' private room, and after lunch the court was crammed to excess in anticipation of their lordships delivering judgment. The Lord Chancellor, on entering the court, said they had satisfied themselves by hearing Mrs. Jackson that in refusing to go to her husband's house and in continuing her resistance, she had acted entirely on her own free will. He certainly could not assent to the proposition put forward by Mr. Collins. In his opinion, no such right as Mr. Collins claimed for a husband existed in law, or ever had existed. No English subject had any right to imprison any other English subject, whether wife or not, and he held that the circumstances of this case were ample justification for the court in refusing to allow the husband to retain possession of the lady. There was an absence of any apparent sense of delicacy in the way the affair had been conducted. In his judgment, the lady must be restored to liberty. Both judges subsequently announced their concurrence with the Lord Chancellor in his judgment, although they gave other grounds for their decision. While judgment was being delivered, Mrs. Jackson quietly left the court and withdrew through the corridors and the judge's chambers, leaving the building entirely. With the judgment that she is free to leave her husband, Emily escapes. But the case is not over for some time, and there are repercussions. Feelings are running particularly high with Mr. Jackson, his friends, and many men in the area in general. From the Newcastle Evening Chronicle, the 31st of March, 1891. Extraordinary scenes. Another unsuccessful attempt was made at Clitheroe last night to burn an effigy of Mrs. Jackson. Large crowds gathered in the streets, hooting and groaning, as one Saturday night the hostile demonstration being particularly marked in front of Mr. Baldwin's house, Mrs. Jackson's sister. Extra police have been brought into the town from Blackburn, and to this is probably owing the fact that there was no renewal of the rioting of Saturday. The police were at times severely hustled. Several divorce cases that come up are now left without judgment, as it is interpreted that a wife can just leave her husband and be done with the marriage. Two of the judges within the case are called in to explain themselves to Parliament. From the Newcastle Evening Chronicle, the 17th of April, 1891. The Clitheroe case. The Clitheroe case was explained in the House of Lords last night by two of the judges who gave the Court of Appeal decision. The judgment had been misunderstood. It simply means that a husband may not whip or imprison his wife in his own house, that is, should she refuse obedience, and it is not to be taken as a precedent by magistrates for refusing to grant separation orders. The outcome of the controversy seems to be that a wife really has much more freedom than had been commonly supposed, for there is no power to compel her to live with her husband should she be disinclined to do so. With continuing rumblings and the many attempts to burn an effigy of her on her brother's front lawn, Emily herself releases a statement about the relationship with Mr. Jackson. From the Taunton Courier and Western Advertiser, the 29th of April, 1891, the Clitheroe case. Further statement by Mrs. Jackson. A further instalment of the narrative by Mrs. Jackson of Clitheroe concerning her relationship with her husband has been published. She first describes her marriage, how he left her home alone, took a train to Blackburn, and was married there, none of her friends being present. After the ceremony, she and her husband went for midday dinner with some friends, Mr. Jackson surprising her with a rebuke before her friends for dropping her H's. The wedding day appears to have been spent in walking about, paying visits, and in the evening the husband, to quote his wife, asked me where I was going to spend the night. I said I was going home, and she did, and Mr. Jackson returned down to Blackburn and after having a brief but apparently very disagreeable interview with his wife's relatives. Next day, Sunday, she went to see her husband and says she found him packing up for New Zealand. I was just like one dazed in a dream. I was very much excited, very sorry he was going, and tearful. I should have been glad if he had stayed, but he always said he must go. 3 days later he departed, but meanwhile her family had written him letters of reconciliation, and the settlement of her property had been arranged. The husband, in the event of his surviving his wife, coming in for his life into her income of £600 a year. She continues, I have wished to make clear what my feelings in marrying Mr. Jackson. I believe the earnest protestations of affection made during our short engagement. I believe that he cared for me for myself alone. I yielded to his wish for a speedy marriage because I thought and hoped marriage with him would mean happiness for us both. And on my side, I say most positively that I meant to be all that a good wife should be to him, and that I had no thought of him except such as a wife should hold of her husband. What I have now traced the course of events which changed all my feelings of love for Jackson, and which led me to realize the mistake I had made. The first of these was the lady's apprehension of the rough life of New Zealand, and being in delicate health, she wrote to her husband begging him to return and looking forward to living happily together in England. The rest of the instalment composed of letters from her husband in New Zealand, which are couched in terms affectionate as any wife could desire. The third part of Mrs. Jackson's narrative commences with statements of her disappointment when she received the letter from her husband in New Zealand asking for money to bring him and his friend back to England. This, she says, opened her eyes to the conviction that she had not been sought for her own sake. Her annoyance was increased when she learned how greatly Miss Jackson, her husband's sister, was in her brother's confidence. In April 1883, Miss Jackson wrote twice to know if the money had been sent out to bring her brother back. Mrs. Jackson, writing to her husband from Clitheroe on the April the 9th, 1888, said, Now about your coming home, of course I shall be glad to see you, but as to Dixon, I think it is a most absurd idea following you back when he went away for a purpose and has never yet given it a trial. I have nothing whatever to do with him, and therefore he must do as he likes, as he thinks best. One thing has annoyed me greatly. Everything in your letter you have told not to repeat. I find currently talked of both in Clitheroe and Blackburn almost before I knew the news myself. I cannot understand this sort of thing at all, and have never been accustomed to it. Miss Jackson keeps annoying me, writing nothing but about money, that I have been compelled to let her know I intend to be sole mistress of my money and interfered with by nobody. I now plainly see why you have married me, and I am very sorry I was blind enough not to find it out. If you think you have any prospect of making money if you remain where you are for a time, you had better do so. I can manage to get on quite well. Mrs. Jackson received on the July the 12th 2 letters from her husband, which she describes of the most contradictory character. From the reply to the letter given above, the following are extracts. Your letter is an insult to me and mine. I cannot understand how you have dared to write such a one. About the coming home was at your own request that I gave up starting anything here and have waited till now for means to return. As I have been ill nearly all the time, it has been anything but pleasant. You knew quite well what I had, and did not care to ask Rainsford for more, and you were the right one to ask. As for Dixon, had it not been for him, I should have died. Do not make any mistake. There shall be a perfect understanding between us, but I shall make it, not you. It is a most ridiculous thing for you to say you will have this or that. It depends upon whether I approve or not. As far as the farming is concerned, I never asked you for any money for it, or indeed for anything else, save my passage home, which is entirely your own fault. For had you come here, it would not have been required, and you would have had a comfortable home. You either would not or could not do so, so you must take the just consequences. Emily's affirmations, giving a fuller view of the case, helps, and things calm down for her. If anything, emotions now tend to the opposite spectrum. A popular street ditty is made up regarding Emily and played in the theatre. So popular was the song that Emily's solicitor attempts to have it banned. From the Taunton Courier and Western Advertiser on the 6th of May 1891, the Clitheroe case, seen in a theatre. Some excitement was caused at the Apprentices Theatre in Blackburn the other night by the service of a legal document from a firm of solicitors formally prohibiting the singing of a song extensively advertised, Mrs. Jackson, dealing with the Clitheroe abduction proceedings. Notwithstanding the prohibition, the song was given the refrain, "Woman is the master now, men must all obey," been taken up and sung uproariously by a crowded audience. Emily ended her life as a spinster, continuing to live with her sister. That concludes this end of month crime compilation, The Wicked World of Rogues. We really hope that you enjoyed the show. If you did enjoy the show, please can you consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel if you haven't done so already. We very much appreciate the kind support of our channel. The likes, subscriptions, comments and shares help to keep this channel alive under some rather hefty competition. Many thanks to everyone for your kind support. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles.